You're here, we're here. We'll get started promptly. Thank you. Thank you all for coming. I think I know some of you, not everyone. My name is Penny Wright. I'm in charge of adult programs here, and we're so happy that you came today. I don't know how we found out maybe 6 or 8 months ago that a wonderful book had been written about Rocky Graziano, and that the author of that book lives part-time in East Hampton. And his name is Jeffrey Sussman, and he's here today, and we're delighted to have him here. Mr. Sussman is the author of 12 nonfiction books, and the most recent one is Rocky Graziano, Fists, Fame, and Fortune. By the way, he brought 6 copies. If anyone wants to buy it, you certainly may. He's written 3 books about boxing, one of which will be published in May, in just a couple of months. His other books include Max Baer and Barney Ross, Jewish Heroes of Boxing, No Mere Bagatelle, a biography of legendary handbag designer Judith Lieber, and he will be here at some point to talk about Judith Lieber. Power Promoting, How to Market Your Business to the Top, How to Sleep Without Drugs, there you go. See How Run, Creative Fitness for Baby and Child, Fit for Life, and 4 health and fitness books. And he is also the president of a marketing PR firm, www.powerpublicity.com, which represents authors, publishers, law firms, real estate companies, artists, art galleries, and fashion companies. He's a very busy gentleman, and we are honored that he came here today to talk to us. Please welcome Jeffrey Sussman.
Thank you. Does everyone here know who Rocky Graziano was? Yes? Because it's amazing how many people have forgotten about him. And yet, in the late 1940s and in the early 1950s, the 2 most popular Italian Americans in the United States were Frank Sinatra and Rocky Graziano. And everyone, of course, knows who Frank Sinatra is, but Rocky Graziano's fame has been diminished considerably. His life is very, very interesting. He was born in absolute dire poverty. His father was an alcoholic and failed boxer, and his mother was schizophrenic. They were so poor that they used to send Rocky out when he was 4 and 5 years old to steal coal for the pot-bellied stove that they had in their small home in Brooklyn. And in the winter, they would send him to dig clams out of the beach at Coney Island. It was the only source of protein in their lives. Now, when Rocky was only 6 years old, his father, who fought under the name Fighting Nick Barbella, the family name was originally Barbella. Rocky was born as Tommy Rocco Barbella. His father would put boxing gloves on him when he was 6 years old, and on his older brother Joey, who was 10, and Joey would beat up Rocky, and the father would cheer them on. And this obviously generated a lot of anger in Rocky. And by the time he was 6 years old, he quit school. And he was mugging kids on the street, stealing their lunch money, and generally getting into a lot of trouble. But by the time he was a teenager, he joined a street gang. He and his family had moved into Manhattan. They lived on 10th Street and First Avenue. And Rocky belonged to a gang of young teenage hoodlums. And his ambition at that time in life was to grow up and become a racketeer. And his role model was the actor George Raft. He was dressing like George Raft, combing his hair like George Raft, imitating George Raft's speech patterns. And he had a friend named Terry Young, who told Rocky that because he was getting into so many street fights and he was so good at street fighting that he ought to try boxing. And Terry brought him to a boxing gym and got him in a ring, and Rocky lost the fight very badly. He didn't know how to box. He could beat up anyone in a street fight, but he didn't know how to handle himself in a boxing ring. And he kind of blew it off and decided boxing wasn't for him. And he kept getting into more and more trouble. Eventually he was drafted, and this is the beginning of World War II. He was drafted into the Army, and he was sent to Fort Dix in New Jersey, where he refused to get up at reveille. He would stay in bed till 10 a.m. And when taps blew at night, he was nowhere to be found. He was out gambling or drinking or whatever he was doing. And his company commander called him in and was going to punish Rocky for his behavior. And the first thing he said to Rocky, he said, "So you think you're a tough guy, huh?" And Rocky took that as a challenge and knocked out his company commander. After that, he went AWOL. And his friend Terry Young said to him, maybe you should really give boxing another try. So he took Rocky to a very famous boxing gym in New York called Stillman's Gym, which was on 8th Avenue and 54th Street. And he introduced him to a boxing manager named Irving Cohen, who was just the kind of person that Rocky should have had as a father. He was very patient, he was very understanding, he didn't mistreat Rocky. And Rocky was a very handsome young man. And Irving took one look at him and he said, you're too pretty to be a boxer. If you become a boxer, your face is going to get messed up. And Rocky said, I don't care. It doesn't matter to me. I decided I want to be a boxer. So Rocky decided that in order to avoid being arrested by the military police, which were out looking for him, he would change his name. Now, his sister had been dating a man named Rocky Graziano. That Rocky Graziano was in prison. So Rocky figured, he doesn't need the name, I'll take it. And that's how he became Rocky Graziano. And he fought under the name Rocky Graziano. He had 8 fights as a welterweight fighter, and he won all 8 of those fights. And after the last fight, the military police showed up. They finally caught on to who Rocky Graziano was, and he was arrested and tried, and he was convicted, and he was sentenced to Leavenworth Barracks for a year. At Leavenworth Barracks, he met an old friend of his from the Lower East Side who was being picked on by a hillbilly from Tennessee, a big guy who was the heavyweight boxing champion of Leavenworth Prison. And Rocky was incensed that this guy was picking on his friend, who was a little guy from the Lower East Side. So Rocky went and beat up the heavyweight hillbilly from Tennessee. And the coach of the boxing squad at Leavenworth said, you just beat up the best boxer we have here. You're going to have to join the boxing squad. And Rocky joined the boxing squad. He learned to become a very proficient boxer. He took lessons and so forth. And he pretty much defeated everyone who he boxed against. When he got out of there, he returned to Stillman's Gym, and Irving Cohen put him in touch with a great boxing trainer, a man named Whitey Bimstein, who had trained over 100 boxers. He was considered one of the finest boxing trainers around. And he understood that Rocky was very headstrong. He wouldn't listen to a lot of the information he was being given. But he gave Rocky a very long leash. He understood that if you tried to put Rocky on a short leash, he would just rebel and he wouldn't do anything. During this time, Rocky's sister, Yolanda, had befriended a woman named Norma Unger. And she kept trying to introduce Norma to Rocky. And Rocky wasn't interested. One night, dressed in his best racketeering outfit, and wearing a pork pie hat, which he pulled down over his forehead. He was coming down the stairs of the tenement in which they lived in, and Norma and Yolanda were in the bottom of the stairs in the stairwell talking, and Yolanda grabbed Rocky's sleeve. He was wearing a shiny blue suit. Grabbed the sleeve of his suit and said, "I want to introduce you to Norma Unger." And he said he didn't want any part of it, but she wouldn't let go of his sleeve. And he kept looking down at the floor. And she said, "Well, at least say hello to her." And he lifted his face and looked at her. And all of a sudden he thought she had the most beautiful eyes he had ever seen. And he was suddenly smitten with this woman, but he didn't want to admit it to anyone. And he, one night he was driving, he had an old Ford Jalopy, and he was driving it around Greenwich Village, and he saw her walking down 8th Street at night, and pulled up alongside of her and said, "You know, you ought to come out of the rain. I'll give you a lift." And she got in the car, and they started talking, and they became very good friends. And then he drove her back to where she lived in Brooklyn on Ocean Parkway, and he parked in front of her house and walked her up to the lobby of the apartment building she lived in. And he was looking for her name where they have all the doorbells, and he didn't see anyone named Unger. He saw someone named Leaving, and she pressed that button, and he said to her, "Are you Jewish?" And she said, "Yes, is that a problem?" And he said, "No." And they started going out together, and Rocky's father, who thought that Rocky was still a thief, didn't know that he had become a boxer, thought that Norma was like a gun moll, and that she was involved in thievery with him, and so refused to talk to her, refused to have anything to do with her. It was interesting when these two got married, they didn't have any money, and Norma's parents had given her a gold Star of David, and in order to get money for the marriage license, she pawned it and gave the money to Rocky. He was very upset that she did that. And they got married at City Hall, and when they came up to the wedding ceremony, they needed a pair of witnesses. And so Rocky went out into the hall and asked these two cops if they would be witnesses to his wedding ceremony. And they recognized him because these two cops had arrested Rocky when he was a teenager. and he managed to give them $5, thanking them for it. And a couple of weeks later, he went out and got Norma's star back for her. There was an interesting story. During World War II, very few men were walking around in civilian clothes. And Rocky and Norma had gone out to a restaurant on West 8th Street in Greenwich Village one night. And they came out of the restaurant, and at the same time, 3 drunken sailors had come out of a bar next to the restaurant. And they saw Rocky out of civilian clothes, and they started shouting at him epithets for homosexuals, calling him a fag, queer, a homo, and so forth. And when they saw Norma, they figured if he's with her, she must be a transvestite, so they started calling her a transvestite and other ugly names. And Rocky said, "Just ignore them, they're drunk." And they walked east towards 5th Avenue, and then they walked 1 block north on 5th Avenue. And then they turned west on 9th Street, and the sailors were still behind them, shouting out all these ugly epithets. About a third of the way down West 9th Street, Rocky squeezed Norma's hand and he said, "Stand here, don't do anything, I'll be right back." He turned around and he went and he punched the largest of the 3 sailors and knocked him out with 1 punch. He beat up the 2nd sailor, and the 3rd one ran away, shouting for the police, saying there was a madman on the street. Rocky went back to Norma, grabbed her hand, and they ran to the subway station on 14th Street and 6th Avenue, and took the subway back to Brooklyn. I was talking to Rocky's daughter last week, whose name strangely enough, is Roxy. And I asked her, I said, why do you think your mother fell in love with this guy? I mean, he was a grade school dropout. He was a poor Italian Catholic. Your mother came from a more or less middle-class Jewish family. She was a high school graduate. What did they have in common? She said, her mother took one look at Rocky and thought he was absolutely gorgeous and fell in love with him. And that was the beginning of their romance. And she said that they were madly and passionately in love with each other for the rest of their lives. A friend of mine, who is a retired New York City organized crime detective, said he used to go to various bars in the city where organized crime figures hung out. And Rocky had some friends from that era who hung out there. And on Friday nights, they were always there with their girlfriends. He said, but Rocky was never with a girlfriend. He remained faithful to his wife for the rest of his life. He said something that Paul Newman used as a line, which I'll get to a little later. Someone asked Paul Newman why he didn't cheat on his wife, Joanne Woodward, and he said, why should I go out for hamburger when I have steak at home? And that line originally came from Rocky Graziano, who gave it to Paul Newman. Let me see where I'm here. Rocky moved up from being a welterweight fighter to being a middleweight fighter. He had a number of fights, losing very, very few of them. The only people he lost fights to were a man named Henry Green. He lost 2 fights to, and a man named Steve Riccio, who gave up boxing after that and became a cab driver. The Riccio's sons are the ones who own and started Barnes & Noble bookstores. But after Rocky moved up to being a middleweight, his manager, Irving Cohn, got him a fight for the middleweight championship with a man named Tony Zale, who was known as the Man of Steel. They said he had a jaw of steel. And he also came from a steel mill area in the Midwest. And their first fight, Rocky didn't have a mark on him, and Tony Zale had to go to the hospital. He was so badly beaten, but Tony Zale won the fight. At a rematch in Chicago, it was just the opposite. Rocky's face looked like raw hamburger. Tony Zale didn't have a mark on him, and Rocky won the middleweight championship of the world. There was an event happened where Rocky's left eye was so battered and closed that he couldn't see out of it during the fight, and he couldn't aim his punches well because of that. And so Whitey Dimstein sat him down in his corner and took a $50 and pressed it into the swelling above his eye and cut it open and caused it to drain. They used that same scene in one of the Rocky movies, by the way. And Rocky was able to see after that, and then he was able to beat Tony Zale and become the middleweight champion of the world. He was so proud of what he had done that after the ring announcer announced that he was the new middleweight championship, he grabbed the microphone from the ring announcer and shouted to his mother, Ma, your bad boy done it, your bad boy done it, I'm a champ. He finally felt so proud of himself that he felt that his life had turned around. Oh, I want to digress for a minute because a year earlier, Rocky had given his father 2 tickets to see him fight at Madison Square Garden. And Nick Barbella heard of Rocky Graziano, but he didn't know Rocky Graziano was his son. He still thought of him as Tommy Barbella. And he took the 2 tickets and he sold one and he used the money to buy drinks at a bar. And then he took the remaining ticket and he went to Madison Square Garden. And he sees this fighter coming down the aisle with a bathrobe on or a robe on, silk robe, and it says Rocky Graziano on the back of the robe. And it still doesn't register with his father. But when he takes the robe off in the corner of the ring, all of a sudden the father recognizes him. And he couldn't believe it. This is my son, Rocky Graziano. He's going to be a champion one day. And after the fight, Rocky was in his dressing room getting a rub down from Whitey Bimstein. And he turns over and he opens his eyes and he looks up and he sees his father standing there. And tears are coming down his father's cheeks. And all of a sudden, all the anger that Rocky had for his father, for all the mistreatment that he suffered, it just drained out of him. And all the anger that he felt towards the world began draining out of him. And it was that anger that propelled him into being such a successful boxer. And so in his third bout, what they call rubber match with Tony Sale, he just didn't have that urge anymore to be a killer. He went through the motions and lost the fight, but he didn't care anymore. He did want to fight Sugar Ray Robinson, because Sugar Ray Robinson was considered the best there was. And Irving Cohn said, you're not good enough to fight him. He'll slaughter you. And Rocky said, I want to test myself. I want to fight him. And so Irving said, okay, we'll set it up. And they did. And in the third round, Rocky almost knocked out Sugar Ray. He hit him with such a hard right cross that it sent Sugar Ray to the canvas. And Sugar Ray was stunned. He hadn't ever been hit so hard. And years later, he admitted that he had never been hit as hard as he was hit that night. But in the fourth round, using a combination of very swift punches, which Robinson was known for, he knocked out Rocky Graziano. And you can see that Rocky was badly hurt. With his right hand, he was holding onto one of the ropes in the ring, and his right leg was just kind of jiggling on the canvas because he was so badly hurt. And he only had one other fight after that with a man named Chuck Davey, and he just did that for the money. He got $50,000 for it, and he, once again, he just went through the motions and lost. And he gave up fighting after that. And he didn't know what he was going to do with his life after that. And a producer came to him and suggested that he do a TV show with the comedian Henny Youngman. And they did a TV show in, I think it was 1950 or 1951, called The Henny and Rocky Show, where Rocky would play a straight man to Henny Youngman. So he would come in, Henny Youngman would say something to him like, I had a friend who just went to the doctor and he got very bad news, and Rocky would say, what happened? And Henny would say, well, he just got a diagnosis that he's terminally ill. And Rocky said, what is he going to do? He said, well, he's going to go back to the doctor and get a second opinion to make sure that, that he really is going to die. So Rocky said, well, did he do it? He said, yeah. And so what happened? Well, the doctor handed him a bill, and the guy said, I can't pay it. And the doctor said to him, well, I'll give you another 6 months to live. So those were the kind of jokes that he would be set up to do. And another one that they did was Rocky said to Henny Youngman, so I hear you have a very good marriage. And Henny Youngman said, yes, I do. And Rocky said, well, what's the secret of it? And he said, we go out to a beautiful restaurant. It's dimly lit, have candlelights and soft music playing, and a strolling violinist, and we have a wonderful dinner. And Rocky said, that's wonderful, when do you go? And he said, my wife goes Tuesday nights and I go Friday nights. So those were the kind of jokes that he told. And the show was very popular, except that Henny Youngman was getting so many engagements out of the city that he couldn't continue doing the show. And that was when television was live. They weren't taping in those days. And then there was a TV producer and writer named Nat Hiken, who had created a new TV show called The Martha Raye Show. And Martha Raye was a very popular comedian and singer. And they decided that in order for this show to be successful, Martha should have a boyfriend, who they would call the Goomba. And he would be sort of inarticulate, but very good-hearted, a nice guy, but not the brainiest guy in the world. And someone said, yeah, we should get someone like Rocky Graziano. And then somebody else said, well, why don't we get Rocky Graziano? So Nat Hiken went over to Stillman's gym, and he saw Rocky over there, and he said, do you have an agent? And Rocky said, "No, I don't have an agent, but I have a friggin' manager. You want to talk to him about something?" And Nat said to Rocky, "We'd like to offer you a part in a weekly TV series. It's called The Martha Ray Show. And would you be interested?" And Rocky said, "Sure, I'd be interested." And they offered him a fair amount of money. And the show was so popular that after 6 months, they doubled Rocky's salary. Now, what a lot of people didn't know is that Martha Ray was completely illiterate. She could neither read nor write. She'd been on the stage since she was 4 years old and had never gone to school. And so Rocky would help her to Rocky wasn't the most literate person in the world, but he could read and write. And so he would run through her lines with her, and she would memorize the entire script from going through it with him. And this was live television, and she would have to get everything down pat. Rocky, however, would often forget his lines, and he would improvise, but he was so good at improvising that the lines came out terrifically. And he was becoming more and more popular. So popular that he also started doing TV commercials. And altogether did a total of 3,000 TV commercials for a lot of products. The longest running ones were for Post-Raisin Bran cereals. But he also did one for Lee Miles transmissions, for a yogurt company, for restaurants, and other things. And then in 1955, he worked with a professional writer to do his autobiography, which was called Somebody Up There Likes Me. And it was a huge success. It became the #1 bestseller in the United States and the #1 bestseller in Italy. And because of its huge success, they decided to make a movie out of it. And the directors initially, it's strange how they finally chose who would play the part of Rocky. Initially, it was going to be that actor James Dean, but he died in an automobile crash and couldn't do it. And I personally don't think it was appropriate. Rocky was dark and kind of swarthy, and James Dean was blonde and Nordic looking. So they offered the part to Marlon Brando, and he turned it down. And they offered it to Montgomery Clift, who had played a boxer in From Here to Eternity, and he turned it down. Paul Newman was appearing in a live television drama written by Ernest Hemingway about an aged boxer who goes back in time to his youth. And he was so good at it that the directors asked him to come in and do a screen test for it. And he got the role of Rocky Graziano. And he almost lived with Paul Newman, with Rocky Graziano for 4 months. He learned to imitate the way Rocky talked, the way Rocky walked, and the way Rocky punched. And it was interesting because during the filming, they hired Tony Zale to play the part of Tony Zale. And when he was sparring with Paul Newman in the ring, it was filmed at Stillman's gym. It's the only film that exists of Stillman's gym. Tony Zale got carried away and punched Paul Newman so hard in the ribs, he almost broke his ribs, and they fired him because they couldn't trust him. So eventually they found somebody who looked like a young Tony Zale, who had been an amateur boxer, and he got the part of Tony Zale. And one of the things that I didn't say about Norma earlier was that whenever he would fight, she couldn't go to the fight. She couldn't stand to see him hurt. And in the 1940s, late 1940s, before television, all of his fights were broadcast on the radio until you had Friday night fights, which began in the early 1950s. She couldn't even listen on the radio. The idea of her husband getting beat up was just terrible for her. But yet, when he came home, she was always there for him. She would help clean him up and take care of him. They were very, very devoted to each other. Now, what was also interesting is how Rocky changed as he got older. After all that anger had left him, he became a very warm-hearted and friendly man. He was sitting around in Stillman's gym one day, and he was watching the up-and-coming fighters. And off in a corner, he saw an old fighter who had gone blind. And he found out the guy was living in a crummy, seedy, transient hotel downtown and living on welfare. And Rocky went around to everyone at the gym and collected $10 or $20 from each of them and put some of his own money with that, folded all the money together, went over to this man and put it in his breast pocket and said, I want you to come back every month. You're going to get the same thing every month. He was so kind and generous to people that his wife had to put him on an allowance because she was frightened he was going to give away all of his money. I mean, he was like a one-man philanthropic organization. And a friend of mine was having, a friend of mine was having lunch with two of her girlfriends at a restaurant called P.J. Clark's, which is on 55th Street and 3rd Avenue in the city. And Rocky had a regular table in there, and he was having a lunch there. And he got to talking to this friend of mine, and he took out all of his photos that he had with him and other memorabilia, and he was showing them to her. And as my friend and her girlfriends got up to leave, Rocky said to her, thank you for remembering who I am, and paid their check for lunch. And the reason I mentioned that is because at the beginning, I asked if anyone knew who Rocky Graziano was, because so many people have forgotten who he was. And he was so touched that this woman remembered who he was and liked him so much. And his celebrity continued. He would go on the Johnny Carson show. And it was one night when he was on the Johnny Carson show, Johnny Carson said to him, so I heard when you were a teenager you were a thief. What did you steal? And Rocky said, I stole everything that began with an A. A car, a radio, a refrigerator. He died in 1990, age 71, from he had pulmonary cardiac disease. And I went to his memorial service and funeral that was held at St. Patrick's Cathedral in the city. And there were 1,000 people there. It was just extraordinary, the turnout for this man. He was so beloved. People had so much affection for him that they just turned out in droves. And when the coffin left the cathedral, the police cleared Fifth Avenue down to 34th Street, and it went through the Midtown Tunnel, and they cleared a path for him all along the Long Island Expressway. He was buried in Locust Valley. And he was just the most extraordinary human being, one of the last and probably the most colorful fighters from the golden age of boxing. And anyway, that's the end of my talk.
So question,
I hope that you liked it.
can we ask you questions?
Absolutely, please ask me questions.
Is he buried? Where is he buried?
In Locust Valley,
Is he buried under that name?
Rocky Graziano,
He's buried under that name.
next to his wife.
Oh, I'd like to ask how you got interested in this whole subject.
I got interested in boxing when I was 12 years old. I was a skinny, short kid, and my father was frightened that bigger kids would beat me up. My father grew up in a very tough neighborhood and was an amateur boxer. And one day he brought home for me a pair of boxing gloves, a speed bag, jump rope, and a heavy bag, and he set them up in our basement and gave me boxing lessons. He was a friend of this man, Lou Stillman. And the reason he was friends with him is my father grew up with a man named Abe Simon, who was a heavyweight boxer in the 1940s and fought Joe Louis twice for the heavyweight title and lost both times. And my father arranged with Lou Stillman that I should get 10 boxing lessons at Stillman's gym. And then he paid a middleweight fighter who was training there $100 to give me 10 lessons. And I went every Saturday and got boxing lessons for an hour. And I became a little arrogant with this, and I said to him, I said, I'd like to get in the ring and really try sparring with someone. And he said to me, what are you, crazy? You'll get your head beaten. But I did get a Stillman's gym T-shirt, which I wore until it finally wore out. It was the pride of my wardrobe. So that's how I got involved in boxing. And when the book Somebody Up There Likes Me came out, I read it and I became fascinated by Rocky. And in 1963, I was living in Forest Hills, Queens. And I was walking home. I came out of the subway one night in the summer. I was walking to my apartment, and I saw this man walking the dog in a luxury complex of apartment buildings called Parker Towers. And as I got closer, I recognized that it was Rocky Graziano. And I went up to him and I told him, that he was one of my heroes. And he thanked me for this, and we talked a little bit. And then he said he had to get the dog upstairs because otherwise the dog would take a bite out of his ankle, and thanked me very much. And that was the last time I ever saw Rocky Graziano. But after I had written a book about Max Baer and Barney Ross, I said to my editor, I would really like to write a book about Rocky Graziano because I admired him my whole life. And she gave me the go-ahead to do it, and I did it. It was a real pleasure to do it.
Is it one of those things that once you learn, you tend to remember how to do it? I mean,
I think so. I still have a punching bag, which I practice.
the boxing's popular now because
It's
there's
popular as an
a
exercise
place on
it
Hill
has
Street that opened up. Hill
Yeah,
Street
I saw
Boxing.
that. Yeah, and a lot of women are taking up boxing now because it's a terrific workout, even if you never get in the ring and punch somebody.
You described that powerful scene between he and his father when his father was crying and he felt that kind of killer instinct come out of him. Do you know if they continued their relationship?
I think so. I have a photograph that someone sent me of the two of them standing outside. I think it was at one of Rocky's training camps up in the Catskills, but standing with their arms around each other, and they're smiling. I mean, I think they're really reconciled. And Rocky developed an empathy that he didn't have as a young man, and he never understood why his father was so bitter and angry, and he finally understood. And I think his understanding led him to be empathetic towards his father.
Was his boxing career very long? How many fights did he have?
It lasted about 7 or 8 years.
67?
He started boxing, well, he boxed in a lot of clubs in the early 1940s. And, he would get $100 here and $150 there. But as I guess you could say he started boxing around 1941 and boxed until maybe 1951. So maybe it was 10 years. But it was really vital, I think, for about 7 of those 10 years.
I think he had 67 fights.
Something, yeah, I have his record in the back of my book
Won
there.
52.
Something like that, yeah.
Wow, that's a
Yeah,
lot.
yeah, he had a terrific record. Though Henry Green said he took a dive in his 3rd fight with Rocky. And who knows? I have a book coming out in May called Boxing in the Mob, and I did a lot of research into how many fights were fixed and so forth, and it was extraordinary.
He had a good relationship with Jake LaMotta.
It was interesting. They were very good friends. They had met in reform school, and Rocky, who was such an angry person, said to Jake when they were in reform school, you've got to learn to control your anger. You'll never be a successful boxer until you learn to control your anger. And I wrote 2 pieces about Rocky for a website called boxing.com, and there's a photo with one of them of Jake and Rocky and their wives, and Rocky's first daughter, Audrey, sitting beside a pool in Miami Beach, the 5 of them. And then there's a photograph of Rocky and Jake. He got her on the Martha Ray show for one episode. Now, when I was speaking to Rocky's daughter, Roxy, I asked her what their family relationship was with Jake LaMotta. And she said, well, Rocky always regarded him as a friend and always tried to get him jobs in television or in the movies. He was always in need of money, she said. But she said, Norma did not like Jake. She thought he was not a nice man. And always tried to talk Rocky out of seeing him, but Rocky wouldn't listen to her.
Did they like your book, The Family?
I think so, yes. You know, Roxy said she liked it very much. She's a very nice woman. I spent time speaking with her and exchanging emails with her.
Did he have any sons?
No, Rocky had 2 daughters, Audrey and Roxy, and there are a number of grandchildren.
Did he become wealthy?
He did. But he said he made a lot more money from being in the entertainment business than he did from boxing. And he became a celebrity. Roxy told me of all the different celebrities they used to hang out with. There used to be a nightclub in the city called El Morocco. And Norma and Rocky had moved into the city, and they lived on the corner of 57th Street and 2nd Avenue, and El Morocco was on the corner of 54th Street and second and third, I think, the 2nd Avenue. And they used to go there once a night, and they became very good friends with the owner, and a lot of celebrities used to go there, and they became very good friends with the singer Tom Jones, and Frank Sinatra had befriended Rocky early in Frank Sinatra's career, and met him at Stillman's gym. And Rocky's substitute trainer, a man named Al Silvano, gave Sinatra boxing lessons at Stillman's gym. And Al said that when Sinatra came in, he couldn't believe that this skinny little guy wanted to take boxing lessons. He said he was about 5'6" and weighed 120 pounds. He said he could have lifted him up by his shirt collar. But Sinatra loved boxing, and he became very good friends with Rocky. And there's a photograph of the 2 of them in a nightclub together in the 1940s. And he gave Rocky a part in his movie Tony Rome. And he played his sidekick, a character named Packy, I think the character's name was. And he was also, the family was very good friends with Paul Newman. And Roxy told me that Martha Red was always at their home, and they used to call her Aunt Martha. And from all the TV commercials he did, he made a lot of money. He also took up painting late in life and became very proficient at it.
Do you think it ever bothered him that public persona of sort of the young guy is really, what people found funny?
I don't think
it's like a little like Marilyn Monroe, she really was intelligent, but her persona was something different.
I don't know. It's not something I raised with his family. And as far as I know, he never spoke about it. He used to joke about it. He told a sports writer named Bill Hines, who wrote some very nice articles about Rocky a long time ago. He said, look, when they were looking for someone to play Martha's boyfriend, they said, we need a stupid guy like Rocky Graziano. So he was able to sort of laugh at himself, I think. And he was far from stupid.
Picturing Sinatra taking a boxing lesson, I'm wondering if he had a cigarette hanging out of his mouth.
I don't think so.
The serious question was, did Rocky, you talked about his philanthropy work, did he ever establish a foundation, or was it all just personal giving?
I think it was personal giving. And he remembered all these old friends from the Lower East Side, many of whom were professional criminals. And a lot of them had gone to prison. And when they came out, they didn't have anything. And he would give them money, and knowing that they would probably never pay it back. He was just a very kind-hearted man, perhaps maybe too kind for his own good.
Some of his life stories that you were talking about sounded a lot like Cinderella Man. Little bits and pieces, what you were saying,
right,
reminded me of that movie.
Yeah, in some, that movie is very inaccurate.
Inaccurate.
Yeah, because one of the characters that I wrote about in my previous book was Max Baer, and I spent a lot of time interviewing his son, Max Baer Jr., who's that actor who appeared in the Beverly Hillbillies, yes, played the part of Jethro. And they tried to sue because Max Baer was also a very kind and very generous person. And so, for example, I wrote about it in that book and in my forthcoming book. When he beat up the heavyweight champion Primo Carnera, he broke Primo Carnera's arm, his jaw, and 3 ribs. And Primo Carnera was a product of the mob. He was owned by a gangster named Oni Madden. And after Max Baer beat him up, the mob deserted him. And Max Baer felt so badly that Primo had been deserted that he went and paid all of Primo Carnera's hospital bills. And when Max Baer died, he died at a young man at age 51 of a heart attack. Primo Carnera was in Italy and couldn't attend the funeral. And he flew to California a week after the funeral. And he had his driver take him to the cemetery where Max Baer was buried. And it was at night and the cemetery was locked. And Primo Carnera and his driver climbed over the fence. And they found Max Baer's grave. And according to the driver, Primo Carnera bent down, crossed himself, and said a prayer. And he said, he was the best friend I ever had. You never got that from the movie.
No,
Right?
Did he ever develop a relationship with George Raft?
He did. He did develop a relationship with George Raft, and George Raft used to come and see him in his early days fighting when he was a club fighter. And there was a guy, I can't remember his name, who was in the mob, who was a friend of George Raft, and the two of them would go to Rocky's fights. George Raft was a protege of the gangster Oni Madden, and also wanted to be a racketeer, but he was also a very good dancer. And he got a job as a professional dancer, and that led to his career as an actor. Any other questions? Yes.
We were talking before about Friday night fights, and I don't know if everybody here is old enough to remember them. It's sponsored by Gillette.
Sure.
But it's striking that with pay-per-view now and all the money in boxing, in those days you just watched a championship fight on, I used to watch them with my dad, championship fight on Friday night on, regular TV, network TV. That's interesting how much things have changed with that.
Yeah, once pay-per-view came along, it really got rid of those championship fights that you used to be able to see just by turning on your television and having to endure some Gillette commercials.
And we got to see all the best fighters too.
Oh, sure.
Every one of them.
Yeah, no question about it.
Would you know, did he ever fought at Sunnyside Gardens?
He did.
He did?
He fought at Sunnyside Gardens and St. Nicholas Arena, both of those places before he became well known, especially when he was a club fighter. He fought at those places.
My father was an amateur boxer, and he brought home 16 ounce gloves from my brother and I. And I do very well with them. But I have something in common with you.
Well, it was funny because one of the stories that Max Baer Jr. told me is when he was in college, he wanted to become a boxer, and his father said, "No, you're never going to become a boxer. It's not the life for you." And he said, "Well, I hope you'll teach me how to box." And his father said, "Yes." And they put on these big, puffy boxing gloves, and they went out in the backyard. And Max Baer said to Max Baer Jr., "Look, we'll just spar around. I'll teach you, how to throw a right cross, how to jab and slip a punch and so forth. But we won't hurt each other. We won't hit each other in the face." And Max Baer Jr. got carried away and hauled off and punched his father in the face. And all of a sudden, you could see his father's eyes change. And the next thing he knew, he was lying on the ground looking up at the sky. And his mother was hanging out at the second-story window yelling at her husband, "You killed him! You killed him! How could you kill our son?"
Was Max Baer as big as they portrayed him in that film?
Yeah, he was very, very big. He was, I think he was 6'2" or 6'3", and there's a very good movie, by the way, if you ever want to see it. It's called The Prize Fighter and the Lady. It came out in 1935. It stars Max Baer and Myrna Loy, and it was voted one of the 10 best movies of 1935. And Max Baer not only was a good actor, he was a good singer and dancer.
Prize Fighter and the Lady?
Prize Fighter and the Lady. It's a very good movie. It's a musical. It's delightful. Any other questions? But thank you for coming.
Thank you.